From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. By now, you've probably heard the news that CBS's Late Show with Stephen Colbert was canceled. Maybe you were bummed out that you'd find fewer laughs on network TV. But to many, it seems as if the show's termination is about something much more serious. Another successful effort by Donald Trump to crush dissent and send a message that those who speak out will face consequences. Today on Lever Time, I talk to the author of the new book, Murder the Truth, who brings us inside the movement to use the legal system to bully media companies, news outlets, and journalists into silence. This is not just coming from Donald Trump. It's a larger crusade by those with political power and money to try to shut up anyone speaking truth to power. This isn't merely about news outlets and journalists. This is about everyone's right to express opposition to what's happening in this country right now. That's coming up on today's episode.
I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposely negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. We're going to open up those libel laws.
This was Donald Trump at a 2016 campaign rally in Texas.
So that when the New York Times writes a hit piece, which is a total disgrace, or when the Washington Post, which is there for other reasons, writes a hit piece, we can sue them and win money instead of having no chance of winning because they're totally protected.
At the time, this didn't get much attention. It seemed like typical Trump bluster, a lot of bravado and hot air, but not much else. Fast forward 9 years, and America's libel laws protecting journalism are still technically intact. But Trump, especially in his second term, has managed to weaponize those laws to get a lot of what he's wanted. He sued ABC News for defamation over its characterization of a trial involving allegations of sexual assault. And he got ABC to fork over $15 million for his presidential library. He sued the Des Moines Register, alleging that its poll overstated Iowa voters' support for Kamala Harris. And most recently, he sued CBS's parent company, Paramount, alleging that it deceptively edited an interview with Kamala Harris to try to help Democrats win the 2024 election. Paramount, whose proposed merger was under review by Trump's administration, agreed to pay $16 million to Trump's library as well. In response to the settlement, CBS Late Show host Stephen Colbert recently aired it all out on national television.
Paramount paid Donald Trump a $16 million settlement over his 60 Minutes lawsuit. As someone who has always been a proud employee of this network, I am offended. And I don't know if anything will ever repair my trust in this company.
Colbert couched the criticism inside of a joke.
But just taking a stab at it, I'd say $16 million would help.
But Colbert did not leave it there. He actually connected the dots.
Now, I believe this kind of complicated financial settlement with a sitting government official has a technical name in legal circles. It's big fat bribe. Because this all comes as Paramount's owners are trying to get the Trump administration to approve the sale of our network to a new owner, Skydance. Not the music I was expecting? Okay.
3 days later, CBS's parent company, Paramount, announced that it's ending Colbert's show, and Trump celebrated, writing on social media, quote, "I absolutely love that Colbert got fired." And then, only a few days after that, CNN reported this bombshell.
President Trump has filed a $20 billion with a B dollar lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal and conservative media giant Rupert Murdoch. The president now accusing the newspaper of libel after it published a story about a birthday letter Trump allegedly wrote to Jeffrey Epstein back in 2003. Trump denies ever writing the letter.
Looking at all of this, you may think these Trump spats are a whole lot of sound and fury, but not much more than pissing contests. You may think these legal cases are only about big media companies and not much else. But a new book argues that this is all part of something much bigger. An attempt to shut down free speech, intimidate journalists, and bully media outlets into submission. The book is called Murder the Truth: Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. It's written by New York Times reporter David Enrich. The book documents an entire movement. Some might call it a master plan. to make it scarier and more expensive for news outlets to report critically on Trump, billionaires, corporations, and really anyone with political power and money. We at The Lever have reported on pieces of this. Our own audio series, Master Plan, detailed the early inklings of the American right's assault on journalism and media after the infamous conservative manifesto, the Powell Memo. Back in the 1970s, decades before the Colbert brouhaha, CBS's own president wrote a letter saying that he had become convinced that, quote, our free enterprise system is in danger, and he promised that he was using his power to, quote, correct the situation at CBS News with some results. We also more recently reported on a Texas version of the Trump tactics, where a billionaire tried to sue Democrat Beto O'Rourke for defamation for O'Rourke's criticism of big money in politics. And we reported that Texas Republican lawmakers just this year considered a sweeping set of legislative changes that could have eroded First Amendment protections and emboldened corporations and powerful individuals to use retaliatory lawsuits to try to silence their critics. Though that legislation was defeated, it was a reminder that Trump's war on journalism is not isolated to him. It's part of a coordinated campaign, as that book, Murder the Truth, shows. So today I'm talking to the book's author, David Enrich, about this new movement, how it's growing, and why this is a huge problem not just for journalists, but for everyone. To start out, I asked David Enrich to tell us about a famous Supreme Court case called Times versus Sullivan. I asked him, why is it so important? And why is it now such a target for those who want to try to destroy the free press? Okay, most Americans know what the First Amendment is. Technically, it says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise of it, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In practice, it means the government can't use its power to silence the media, the press. And underneath that broad principle is this court ruling called Times versus Sullivan. So let's start there. For those who don't know what that ruling is, tell us about it and why its protections for journalists are so important.
Well, the short version is that this is a 1964 decision. I won't go into all of the very interesting history about it, but the bottom line is that the Supreme Court created what is known as the actual malice standard, which says that if you're a public figure or an elected official, someone like that, in order to win a defamation lawsuit, you need to prove not only that something was written or said about you that is false and defamatory, you also need to prove that whoever spoke or published those words did so either knowing that what they were saying was false, so in other words, lying, or did so with reckless disregard for the truth. And this was a very high bar that the Supreme Court deliberately created to make it much harder for public officials and other powerful people to file frivolous lawsuits and to use those frivolous lawsuits to get critics to shut up or to get journalists and others to stop scrutinizing the powerful in this country. And that is obviously at the heart of the First Amendment, because one of the biggest checks on concentrated power in the United States is supposed to be the media and the right of everyone, including the public, to have free speech. So this decision in 1964, it really ushered in a golden era of investigative journalism. And it is not a coincidence that in the intervening years after this, we had the Pentagon Papers, we had Watergate, we had a lot of investigative reporting that exposed the lies of various administrations about the war in Vietnam. And to this day remains one of the most important and powerful bulwarks against federal government or powerful individuals trying to shut up and silence criticism and scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, we at The Lever think about this all the time, right? Like the risk matrix of reporting on powerful people. One of the things that we think about all the time is these standards that as long as we are getting the facts right, and we have to focus on getting the facts right, that is supposed to be a protection under not just the First Amendment, but under the Times v. Sullivan standard that you can report on powerful people, even if they don't like it. Now, you point out in your book that Trump in 2016 said that he wants to, quote, open up our libel laws, which you suggest ignited a legal movement aiming to eliminate the Trump v. Sullivan precedent, or at least limit it. Who else is working on that particular cause and why?
Well, there's a whole network of people and groups that are pushing this, and it ranges from kind of a who's who of traditional kind of conservative pressure groups like the Heritage Foundation, the Claremont Institute, the Federalist Society. There are a bunch of very high-powered lawyers who are also pushing this. But I think the biggest and most important network are just a lot of big, angry individuals and companies that really it is not in their interest to have journalists sniffing around in their affairs, and therefore have been campaigning in the court system all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to get the justices to either eliminate or at the very least kind of narrow and dilute this standard.
What specifically would that look like? What are they asking for?
Well, and what they're asking for is an outright overturning of New York Times versus Sullivan. I think that is a little bit far-fetched at this stage, given what we know about the thinking of a bunch of the justices. I mean, there are at least two justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, who have openly said that they would like to see this overturned. And we don't really know where other conservative justices fall on this. I think a much more likely scenario than it being overturned outright, at least in the short term, is that it is narrowed in some ways. And one of the easiest ways and simplest ways to do that would be to narrow the group of public figures who have to hit this higher actual malice standard. So what that would look like in practice is the Supreme Court originally in 1964, it created the standard only for public officials. So like people who hold government office or were elected, things like that. It then, in a series of subsequent decisions, broadened the group to everyone from a celebrity or a professional athlete to someone like a university president or a wealthy businessman or a private company or something like that. And I could see them narrowing it to basically reduce the number of people and institutions that would have to hit this higher standard. And, this is taking me like 45 seconds to explain, and I realize it's a little bit complicated and nerdy, but it's so important because if that group were narrowed, it would mean that anytime someone wrote about or spoke openly and critically about a big company or even like a local real estate developer in your community or your local restaurant that you don't like, if you got any facts wrong about them, you could be held liable. And instead, the standard we have right now is even if you accidentally make a mistake, as long as it's in good faith, you are legally protected. And that creates an environment where we can have robust, sometimes like heated criticism and interrogation and scrutinizing of the most powerful people in our community or in our country. And I think that's really important.
Up next, I talked to David Enrich about the Stephen Colbert situation at CBS and how Trump is weaponizing existing libel laws to target his critics. We also discuss how companies like United Health are using similar tactics. Okay, so as of now, Donald Trump and this movement that you're talking about have not yet destroyed the Times v. Sullivan precedent. There is still this higher standard, which is designed to give everyone in the country, news outlets, journalists, citizens, a freer right to essentially criticize or at least report things and say things that those powerful people don't want reported and said. That precedent is still there. But it seems to me that Trump is trying to maybe make this debate, if not moot, then trying to circumvent it, because he's managed to weaponize existing libel laws under the current precedent, even though they theoretically make it hard to actually win the cases. The idea that he and others seem to be operating under is that even the threat of a lawsuit or a failed lawsuit still incurs huge costs on journalists and news outlets, even if they get stuff right. So just filing lawsuits, no matter how frivolous, ends up sending a message. And my question for you on that is, do you think those messages, these threats of lawsuits, the filing of lawsuits, seeing companies, big companies like Disney and Paramount settle with Donald Trump, do you think that creates a chilling effect throughout the entire media, convincing reporters and news outlets to shape their coverage, limit their coverage, avoid certain topics and the like?
Well, that is a broad question, but I think the answer is in some cases, yes. Not in all cases, but I think that it really depends on the circumstances. And Look, as part of my book, I talked to reporters all over the country, very few of whom work at a place like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They work much more often at a local newspaper, or maybe they're independent and just have a Substack newsletter or a blog or something. And for people like that, forget about a lawsuit. A legal threat from a big law firm or from an in-house counsel at a big company can be terrifying. People do not have the resources to risk their homes, their livelihoods, their 401ks to go up against a giant company and their high-priced lawyers. And so the rational thing to do in a situation like that is often to find a different topic to write about it. But look, I think it also is happening increasingly at a national level as well. And that is certainly by design. And I think what we have seen with ABC News and CBS News in the past several months, with them settling lawsuits that most legal experts regarded as weak at best, is a sign that the companies behind those news organizations do not have the stomach for legal fights. And I think that it is very easy to see situations where journalists kind of anticipate that type of response from their owners and therefore pull punches. And that is a kind of a very infectious type of self-censorship. And the problem with it is that often it's going to be invisible and intangible almost. And we don't know what stories are going to be missed because people are being conditioned to anticipate very severe consequences for pursuing the most ambitious, aggressive, important targets. And if they're not doing that, who knows what secrets are being unexposed, what wrongdoing is not being publicized.
I also think that seeing the big guys, if you will, do that, if you're in media and you watch it, you're like, well, listen, if those big guys with all the money and a bunch of power are standing down, who am I at a mid-sized newspaper or at an independent news outlet?
It almost works to me with the same outcome, but in kind of the opposite way. In my time talking to a lot of independent and local journalists, those people have guts and courage, and they're trying not to think about what the financial consequences will be. Sometimes they have to, but really the effect that I've already seen this happening is that when people settle, when ABC or CBS or others settle, it incentivizes people like Trump, but by no means only Trump, to do more of this. I mean, some of Trump's advisors on the CBS News and the Des Moines Register lawsuit have been open with me that they see the willingness of CBS and Paramount to even negotiate a settlement, much less reach one, as a sign that they should go full steam ahead with these tactics. And again, it's not just people in the political realm that are using these tactics. It's big companies and wealthy individuals as well. And they can see the writing on the wall too. And so it provides a direct incentive for people to file and companies to file more and more of these lawsuits. And even if those lawsuits are unsuccessful in court, they exact huge tolls financially and psychologically. And it has a real effect over time.
Now, beyond the libel laws, the weaponization of libel laws, Trump also seems to be using the fact that he's the head of government as an implicit threat. Yeah. Take the CBS situation as an example. CBS's corporate parent is trying to get regulatory approval for a merger right now. Trump freaking out on CBS and filing a lawsuit sends a message that if CBS doesn't play ball, doesn't do what he wants in that lawsuit, their merger could be rejected or at least face hurdles. Now, presidents in theory always could have done this, right? I mean, the president is the head of government, has all sorts of agencies, and these news outlets are businesses themselves. I guess the question is this a dynamic that's always existed and Trump is making it more explicit, or is this something new?
I don't know if I can answer that definitively, but he is definitely embracing the strategy more enthusiastically and more explicitly than any president that I am aware of in the past. I can't say it never happened. The Nixon administration was extremely aggressive and boundary pushing in the creative lengths it went to shut down negative press. But I mean, look, there's very little question here about Trump's intent with sticking with this lawsuit against CBS, even after he was elected, and the fact that there was this merger pending, and that gave him enormous leverage. And he, in fact, increased the amount he was seeking in the lawsuit from a preposterous $10 billion to an even more preposterous $20 billion. And again, even putting aside Trump's intent, we know the effect, which was that inside Paramount's executive suites, they were very worried. They thought that as long as this lawsuit was outstanding and had not been resolved to the satisfaction of the president, they were not going to be able to get this deal through. And so they reached this settlement. They also apparently got the company that was buying Paramount, to throw in a big sweetener and agree to do $15 million of public service announcements that are favorable to the Trump administration. And again, this has raised a lot of criticism among a lot of people, not just Democrats, that this is essentially bribery.
You recently reported, and you've just alluded to, that this strategy goes beyond just politicians who don't want to be embarrassed by stories that are printed. It's also being adopted by big corporations. Your story for the New York Times was about United Health's legal tactics in this realm, in the aftermath of the murder of its CEO. Tell us about what United Health has been doing as an example of how this goes way beyond politics.
United is a version of what a lot of other companies have done. They're just taking it further than most people have in the past. So they've hired a law firm called Clare Locke, which is notorious in the media industry for just being extremely aggressive and have no holds barred on behalf of clients that are often not like choir boys, let's put it that way. And so what United Health has Clare Locke doing is scouring the web for any negative references to United Health and seeking to threaten people and coerce them essentially into taking down that content or apologizing for that content. And they're often in these letters and legal filings directly invoking the murder of their CEO last December and basically using that to argue that intense criticism of the company risks inciting future violence. And that's what they're saying. And the tactics at times have actually been effective, which I found to be surprising and really notable and not common.
And to be clear, this hasn't just been aimed at news outlets.
Yeah.
This has been aimed at whistleblowers, right?
Yeah, that's right.
For those who are thinking about this, oh, this is just about journalists and media. I mean, we're talking about United Health aiming at basically, critics at large.
Yeah, that's a really important point. As I've been talking about this book over and over again, I keep trying to emphasize the fact that this does not just apply to journalists. It applies to anyone with a social media account or someone who wants to circulate an online petition against something happening in their community. It applies to everyone. And this United Health example really speaks to that because, yes, they are going after journalists. They're including not just people at places like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, but some local journalists as well. But they're also going after, for example, a doctor in Texas who posted an Instagram video about how United Health was kind of haranguing her about coverage for a patient, which led her to pull herself out of surgery and deal with them. She got threatened. There is a documentary filmmaker in Wisconsin who had produced a film about a United Health subsidiary. It was very critical. And instead of threatening her, United Health's law firm went to streaming services like Amazon and Vimeo and essentially threatened them and got them to take down the video. And so, that is exactly what a company like United Health is paying big bucks to do. It sends a very powerful message that when you speak out against a company like that, you risk being either threatened or at least censored. And I think that it's really a sign of the times that big companies like Amazon aren't standing up to those threats. And in fact, they're just finding that the expedient thing to do is to just, this isn't worth fighting with a huge company. Let's just take it down.
We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, I ask David Enrich, what can be done to stop the truth from being murdered? What do you say to those who are listening to this and who say, well, look, the threat of getting sued into bankruptcy is actually good and a necessary deterrent to journalists, news outlets, whoever else, to the public for being cavalier and reckless, and that the threats themselves keep journalists honest. I mean, folks who make this kind of argument probably look around at the media landscape and see evidence that the media has lied to them at times. The lies of the Iraq War, the lies in the lead up to the financial crisis, and so on. And they might argue that the pendulum has swung too far to the side of there being no consequences for getting anything wrong and promoting lies. And they might hear Trump's argument and think he's right about there needing to be a stronger deterrent to getting things wrong. What do you say to that argument?
Well, look, maybe there should be stronger deterrents to getting things wrong. And I think the mainstream media has a problem on its hands with its credibility because, we're good at acknowledging when we get someone's name wrong or a date wrong or something like that in general. And I'm not talking about the New York Times here. I'm talking about the mainstream media in general. But I think in general, we have not been as good as we should be at acknowledging bigger, broader mistakes. Like you mentioned the coverage of the 2008 financial crisis, the Iraq War. I think there's actually been quite a bit of scrutiny over, but the financial crisis is a good example. COVID might be a good example. I mean, I think there are a lot of examples where the mainstream media, could have done a much better job. And we rarely kind of reckon with that in the sort of public way that we try to hold people accountable when we're writing about them. That being said, look, there are, under the existing legal standards, if you lie or are reckless, you can be held liable. And in fact, there are a lot of recent examples of exactly that happening to news organizations, including some mainstream ones. I mean, CNN has gotten banged up a bunch recently in defamation cases. And most famously, on the right, Fox News was held accountable for the lies, or some of the lies anyway, it was peddling about the 2020 election. There are a lot of individuals with huge megaphones on social media, guys like Alex Jones, for example, that have been held accountable for their lies about different things using the defamation laws. So look, you can hold people accountable. There's just a high bar. And I actually think there's some validity to the argument that high bar it does mean that sometimes when journalists do things that are bad, they are not held fully accountable for that. I think there is probably some truth to that. To me, you kind of have to weigh that against the importance of the protection for journalists being fearless and aggressive when they are scrutinizing and trying to hold to account the most powerful and richest people and institutions on the planet. And there's just no way to do that mechanically if you don't have strong legal protections like this. And it, again, does not just apply to people like me who have the privilege or whatever of working at the Times. It's anyone with a social media account or anyone who wants to circulate an online petition, anything like that. So it really affects all of us.
Do you think those who maybe sympathize with Trump's argument, the media gets things wrong, there needs to be a stronger deterrent, do you think there's a conflation of getting something factually wrong and separately being too negative about it? I guess what I'm getting at is I feel like in this conversation about media, it often gets mixed together. Are you getting the actual facts right? That's one thing. And that, to my mind, that's the most important thing. And then, are you presenting the facts in a way that I subjectively, as perhaps the target of the story, that I like or don't like, right? I mean, there's the facts, and then there's what you're also saying about the fact. Oh, these facts show this person's not a good person, or this person's a great person, right?
Yeah.
That I feel like there's this conflation of accuracy, and I don't like how it's being presented. I don't like that it's coming off as negative. And what I think is problematic here is that the Trump argument seems to mostly be, I want to use the libel laws, weaponize the libel laws, or destroy the libel laws to make it easier to punish people, not necessarily for getting things factually wrong, but for presenting facts that I don't like in a way that I don't like. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think you might be being a little too generous to Trump, honestly. I think, which is probably not something you hear a lot, David, but I think in this case, it might be the case because for the most part, the lawsuits he has filed and threatened have not been about things where there's really that much dispute about not only the facts, but the implication of the fact. This has been, and Trump is obviously inhabiting and amplifying a world in which basic facts are up for debate, or to put it differently, he often lies, and the people around him often lie in order to advance their agenda. So I think that's what they're doing. This is not, I do think there's an argument that a reasonable person could make that there's a lot of gray area about the difference between a fact. You can present a bunch of factually accurate statements in isolation that when strung together can create a false impression. And, there's a whole body of case law into how that should be interpreted for defamation standpoint. But I don't really think that's the rationale behind what Trump is doing. I think he is trying, for the most part, to shut down legitimate lines of reporting, legitimate lines of criticism. And he's hoping that, especially as his allies hop on board this bandwagon and file their own lawsuits, that it will not only shut down those lines of inquiry, but it will really change the appetite of the media writ large to pursue this type of reporting. And, there are signs that kind of tactic is becoming increasingly effective.
And meanwhile, when they're not in power, when that movement, when that political ideology is not in power, if the pendulum swings back, in theory, conservative media outlets should want these protections, right? I mean, this does go both ways.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly short-sighted campaign that some folks on the right wing are pursuing. And it is not a coincidence that some of the biggest defamation judgments in recent history have been against some of the most prominent people in the conservative sphere, whether it's Fox News, Alex Jones, Rudy Giuliani, and the list goes on. And it's not that they're the only ones lying, but they have been doing a disproportionate amount of it. And look, there's an interesting case down in Florida, not a lawsuit, but a situation where Ron DeSantis, when he was trying to be the Republican nominee in 2020, he was pushing legislation in the state legislature that would have essentially deliberately violated New York Times versus Sullivan. And the goal was partly to make it easier for people like him to sue journalists, but it was also to provoke this kind of constitutional reckoning and use that as a case to get the Supreme Court to overturn Sullivan. And that legislation did not make it out of the state legislature for one reason and one reason only, which was that conservative talk radio hosts in Florida called their representatives to complain and say, if this law passes, we will be sued into oblivion instantly. And the state legislators recognized that, and so they killed the bill. And I think that is the great thing to me about the First Amendment and about New York Times versus Sullivan, is that it is not designed to protect one party over another or one kind of ideology over another. It applies equally to voices on the left, the right, everywhere in the middle. And I think that is one thing that when I talk to people on the left, I often hear them saying, well, this is great that we can sue Fox News with this, things like that. And we should be filing more lawsuits against Fox News and others. And I just think it's like, maybe you should file more lawsuits against Fox News. I don't know. But I think it's just a dangerous game to be arguing in favor of making it easier to use laws to shut down independent criticism, because it is a double-edged sword and that can boomerang really fast.
I saw in your book that one of Clarence Thomas's sort of allies, I think it was Lawrence Silberman, has essentially argued that it's not a two-way street, that the corporate legacy elite media, the large media outlets in this country, are a haven of left-wing liberalism, and that the laws, therefore, that seem apolitical, seem non-ideological, First Amendment laws and the like, actually in practice are serving to disproportionately protect a liberal campaign against conservatives. Now, I have trouble understanding this argument when I look out at like so much right-wing media, but just to underscore your point, I mean, the laws are supposed to be apolitical. I guess before we conclude, what do you say to Silberman's argument? Like, oh, the laws may seem apolitical, but in fact, they are serving one side disproportionately.
You know, I mean, Silberman, who died a couple of years ago, he was an old man when he said that, and nothing against old men, but he was just completely out of touch with the media ecosystem we were in. And let's even stipulate that he's right, that the mainstream print newspapers are predominantly liberal. You could have a debate about that, but you don't even need to, because there is this cacophony of voices on the right, on the left, everywhere in between that dominates social media, dominates streaming now. And it's just a very different world than what I think he was accustomed to and what he understood. And more important than that, there is a rich history, and I go through a lot of this in my book, of Sullivan and subsequent cases along that line really protecting conservative voices and allowing conservative activists to aggressively critique powerful things on the left that they don't like. And so it really, just empirically, it is not true that this is something that predominantly protects liberals. It's bipartisan and it's neutral, right? And it's been used on both the right and the left to protect speech. And that at times is frustrating to the people's political opponents. And I get that, but that doesn't mean we should shut it down.
Final question. What can be done about this? For instance, there are so-called anti-SLAPP laws that try to punish filers of frivolous defamation and libel suits if their cases lose. The idea being that a higher punishment of a case filer will deter the misuse of these laws. Is that a solution? Or do we have to rely on the media outlets, the big ones that we've talked about, simply not bending the knee? Or are there other things that can be done policy-wise or otherwise to actually deal with the problem that you outlined?
Anti-SLAPP laws exist in, I think, 36 states now in one form or another, and they've proved useful at deterring or at least penalizing the filing of garbage lawsuits that are meant to suppress speech. And the caveat I have, And I'm not saying they're not helpful, but I think their utility is a bit limited because a lot of the people filing these lawsuits in the first place are really wealthy and well connected. And basically you have to pick up the other side's attorney fees, which are maybe $100,000. That's a lot of money to the person who has to pony up that for their legal fees. But often for the aggressors in these defamation cases, it is pocket change. Also, the anti-SLAPP laws don't apply at all to legal threats. And one of the things that I found in my reporting is that is where a lot of the action is. It's before something ever gets to court. It's receiving a threatening letter on fancy letterhead from a law firm in New York or Washington that has a reputation for not only killing stories, but also bankrupting institutions. So I think what do you do about all of this? I don't know. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about legislative fixes to this, to be honest with you. I think the answer is much more about journalists remaining as kind of stiff-spined as possible, and maybe more important, about just members of the public doing what they can to support journalism. And I mean, I welcome everyone subscribing to the New York Times, but I think often it's more important to support a local newspaper or support the person in your community who is doing good journalism, whether that's a Substack or a podcast or a YouTube channel or whatever. And I think that gives journalists the resources to withstand this pressure and at times fight back when needed. And you just have to kind of level the playing field as much as possible.
I'm glad you bring that up because it is slightly self-serving, but I'm going to say it. When people subscribe to The Lever, part of our overhead is making sure that we have some level of defense, not just fact-checking, reporting the stories, but some level of insurance. And it's expensive. And this is part of the risk matrix of just trying to do basic accountability journalism. And that is really what is under threat. And that is why your book is so important. And by the way, why your book has a perfect title. The book is called Murder the Truth, Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. The author is the great David Enrich. David, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. In our show notes with this episode, you'll find a link to David Enrich's book, Murder the Truth. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by me, and it was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, for ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in the episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back later this week with another episode of Lever Time.